Vaccinations, a Rational Discussion Part 1. This presentation is not an attempt to resolve arguments or controversies. It serves only the purpose of informing the listener of the complexity of the topic and the reminder that unless one has an unwavering belief not concerned with data, then always knowledge should precede opinion. So what are the elements comprising the discussion regarding vaccinations? Unfortunately, it's a mixture of facts, opinion, false or old information, and religious and political beliefs regarding government's ability to require vaccination. Understanding beliefs by definition do not require facts, there will always be issues that will never be resolved. And even when scientific data supports the use of vaccination or not, it appears there will always be a strong emotional component to judgment, especially in the case of individual context regarding harm or benefit from vaccination. For example, if you believe your child was harmed by a vaccine, you're against all vaccines and you'll seek evidence to support that belief, versus if you believe your child was saved by a vaccine. And from a public health perspective, the ultimate mediator of decision-making comes down to the issue of the good of a group or society versus the individual. Here's a brief list of common concerns we will address throughout these two presentations. Big Pharma sets this sham up to make money. Our immune systems can handle diseases without the protection of vaccines. We're causing damage and death beyond that of the diseases themselves. Vaccines don't actually work. The ingredients in vaccines or the vaccine itself causes diseases such as autism, with examples such as thimerosal and aluminum. And any of the statistics that support vaccinations are manufactured by the deep state, and any that contradict vaccinations are suppressed by the same. There are basically three perspectives one must consider when examining the evidence. The first is context: who, when, and where. Are we discussing pre- or post-vaccination, in the U.S. or the world, old vaccines or new vaccines, the flu vaccine or all childhood vaccines, etc.? The next two are based on the willingness of an individual to use the math skills they learned in third grade, addition, subtraction, and division. Not high-level statistics, but common sense math that can many times be guesstimated and always doable on a simple calculator. The first is to always include the denominator of any ratio. In other words, if a death rate is 100, what is the denominator? Out of 1,000,000, 100,000, 1,000? And this should also include in both what time period and in what size population of individuals. And is it a percentage or a number? And the last filter, which is often related, is the magnitude of difference. For example, if a rate is a percentage, how large is that? And again, in what size population? For example, 1% is a small percentage, but of what size population to determine the magnitude of effect? We will examine the concepts of denominator and magnitude as we explore the statistics provided by the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. First, though, let's start with context. What if you were required to travel to an area hit by an Ebola outbreak and you were given the option of a vaccine? Would you take it? What if you were bitten by a stray dog or bat? Would you get the rabies vaccine? So what's different? Context. You're not an infant or a child, and the government is not mandating everyone get these vaccines. So the question is, are all other arguments directed by these two base concerns and less about vaccines themselves? So it may be argued that there is a third component. These two disorders are life-threatening. But this, in fact, may not be a distinguishing feature given some of the diseases vaccinated against in childhood may cause death, including measles, the flu, and pertussis as examples. So the real starting point is this simply about a belief or principle which is unaffected by facts? In that case, then there's no point in discussing facts. If it isn't a belief but a concern based on stories or numbers, then the primary goal is to make sure that stories are not isolated cases and that numbers are not manufactured, misunderstood, or incomplete, and to recognize that, unfortunately, people tend to believe an individual's anecdotal narrative over abstract numbers. Before we proceed to the specifics, it's important to, at the very least, understand the general principles of vaccination. Vaccinations are the whole or fractionated bacteria or virus that's been rendered non-pathologic, yet creates a protective immune response to the organism. It's antigenic, but not pathogenic. Generally, the types of vaccines include live attenuated, inactivated, or killed, subunit in the subcategories of conjugate and recombinant, and toxoid. Other terminology and categorizations include monovalent versus multivalent. Monovalent contains one specific antigen, multivalent contains more than one. The most common are the MMR and DTP, which are trivalent. Multivalent can also contain multiple strains of a single disease. An example might be polio with 3 strains, strep pneumonia with 23, and rotavirus with 5 strains. This is actually an important concept with regard to convenience and cost. In other words, giving 3 vaccines at one time, or vaccines for several strains of an organism. However, as we will see, packing more into one shot may decrease the potency of the vaccine, in particular for the flu vaccine, indirectly a reason for failure to protect in some cases. Let's begin with live attenuated. These are rendered harmless or non-virulent. They should not produce symptoms, but do multiply and stimulate an immune response. They have a more rapid response and a more prolonged response. They then need fewer boosters and are then less likely to need adjuvants, which make them less expensive. As you can see, most of these are viral. With killed vaccines, usually heat or formaldehyde is used to destroy the organism while the surface proteins survive. They generally need at least 2 initial doses 10 days apart, and there's a slower immune response taking about 2 to 3 weeks. They may need an adjuvant, making them more expensive to manufacture. And here are examples. Toxoid vaccines are specific and limited. Toxoids are exotoxins from bacteria. Bacteria are made harmless by heat or formalin. However, antigens are still present. Examples include 2 components of the DTP. Some types of newer vaccines include those that target specific aspects of antigenic stimulation. For example, subunit vaccines, which use the epitope only, and recombinant vaccines that use only the genes coding for the antigens, and finally conjugate vaccines which couple with proteins so that the immune cells can recognize that antigen. Conjugate vaccines are workarounds in an attempt to generate a stronger immune response. B cells can produce antibodies without T cell stimulation, but by binding or conjugating a polysaccharide to a protein carrier, a T cell response can be stimulated, which then activates B cells to elicit a larger immune response. Here are examples of common conjugate vaccines. Note the cockles, flu, and pertussis vaccine. Let's begin our discussion with a common concern that big pharmaceutical companies have created the supply-demand need for vaccines. What is true is that the CDC lists only 13 vaccine manufacturers. 75% are produced by 3 companies only. These are produced not in China or India like 80% of medications, but primarily in the US, Canada, and Europe. And also in 1986, Congress passed legislation so that pharmaceutical companies who manufacture vaccines have total legal immunity for any injuries or death caused by vaccines. So the question is, who pays for vaccination-related adverse events? the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program was created, which is a special vaccine court operated by the U.S. government where victims of vaccines must try to sue the U.S. government for vaccine injury and death claims. There is a tax on each injection that goes to a pool for compensation. Total compensation paid over the life of this program is approximately $4.2 billion. Let's start with how many petitions have been awarded compensation. According to the CDC, just from 2006 to 2017, over 3.4 billion doses of covered vaccines were distributed in the U.S. For petitions filed in this time period, 6,467 petitions were adjudicated by the court, and of those, 4,450 were compensated. So here's our first example of the denominator being key. This means for every 1 million doses of vaccine that were distributed, approximately one individual was compensated, 1 out of a million. Since 1988, over 21,000 petitions have been filed. Over that 30-year time period, 18,173 petitions have been adjudicated, with 6,792 of those determined to be compensable, while 11,381 were dismissed. So that's only about 1/3 of petitions compensated. What are the usual reasons for non-compensation? Well, here's an example. Given a common reason for filing a claim is the belief that vaccination causes autism. Let's look at how this has been handled by the government. By March 1st, 2010, 13,330 cases had been filed in the Special Vaccine Court, with 5,617 representing autism cases. Only 2,409 were compensated. The rest were dismissed. Why? The process was that given they couldn't hear all cases, they took 3 test cases that they said represented all the other cases and litigated against those claims. Judges then ruled in each case that vaccines were not the cause of their autism. Then they told everyone else that their autism could not have been caused by vaccines and that they would pay no damages. Scientifically, as we will see, this makes logical sense, but emotionally left parents with a sense of abandonment and with a sense of unfairness. The basis upon which the judges drew their conclusions was not arbitrary and was based on available research that has never found a direct linkage to vaccinations, and in fact has shown that genetics and environmental factors play a significant role coupled with the timing of the diagnosis. Yet for an individual family, this is not a satisfying conclusion, even though it is evidence-based. So there are 2 common reasons for non-compensation. One is the lack of scientific evidence to establish a connection from the perspective of comparing to those who get a disease or disorder and are not vaccinated. In other words, is there a higher rate of that disease in vaccinated individuals? The second is bias. In this case, the timing of the disease with the vaccine is potentially coincidental. In other words, many of the diseases occur at the same age as the time the vaccine is administered, so that it appears the vaccine caused the disease, yet it would statistically likely have occurred based on age. So let's look at some of the issues and associated stats and decide whether we are comparing apples to oranges or whether the information or concept is just bananas. A common argument by those against vaccines is that even the government admits that the flu vaccine is effective in only a small percentage of cases. So why do we need vaccinations for our children? So are these comparable concepts? Flu viruses mutate quickly so that scientists have to guess at strains on a yearly basis, even by country. Effectiveness of the flu vaccine is as low as 19% and as high as 52%, dependent on the year due to the prediction failure. In 2018, for example, with no effective vaccine available to counter the HRN2 strain, the overall effectiveness of the flu vaccine fell to 29%, as reported by the CDC. By contrast, effectiveness was estimated at 49% during the period that H1N1 was dominant. Once H3N2 began spreading, effectiveness decreased to 9%. However, according to the CDC, During the 2016-2017 season, flu vaccination prevented an estimated 5.3 million influenza illnesses, 2.6 million influenza-associated medical visits, and 85,000 influenza-associated hospitalizations. So even at such a low effectiveness rate, still the effect is large. Now, let's compare that to other childhood vaccines. Remember that flu viruses mutate rapidly and change from year to year, and scientists must guess at strains. For the diseases that most childhood vaccines are designed for, strains don't mutate quickly, so the coverage and effectiveness remain stable, such as measles, mumps, polio, etc. Apples and oranges. Another common argument used by those against vaccination is that prior to mandatory vaccinations, all the diseases for which they were created were decreasing on their own. Absolutely correct, due to sanitation and other public health efforts. However, let's look at the stats to see that once again the denominator matters. Here is a chart often used by those against vaccination. Although it is generally correct, the element that's hidden is the rate. Unless you do the math, note that this is deaths per 100,000, the y-axis. Focusing on measles, there is a visual attempt at misrepresentation through a flatlining of deaths from measles by the lowering of the death rate to the zero line. This visual trick is exposed by looking at the actual death rates around the time of measles vaccine introduction in 1963. First, some math. Because this is per 100,000, the zero line will not be visually escaped until one case per 100,000 is met. Given the population around that time was 189 million, until you had 1,890 deaths, which is 100,000 into 189 million, it would visually appear as zero in this depiction. So what was the real death count at and around this time? From this CDC chart of actual deaths, we see it cycled around 400 to sometimes as high as 500, so clearly this would not register on the previous chart due to the large denominator because it didn't meet the threshold of 1,890 that equals 1 per 100,000. The denominator counts. As we will see later, this becomes significant when viewed over decades. And what isn't evident from mortality charts is that in the decade before 1963, when a vaccine became available, nearly all children got measles by the time they were 15 years of age, about 90%, so that an estimated 3 to 4 million people in the United States were infected each year. Also, 48,000 were hospitalized and 1,000 had encephalitis from measles. And yet another argument to disband required vaccinations is that many countries have discontinued or banned vaccination programs. And in fact, Japan, Sweden, and England discontinued pertussis vaccination programs in the 1970s, and the Soviet Union discontinued diphtheria. However, all three countries have reinstated pertussis vaccination due to pertussis epidemics that followed the initial decision to discontinue their programs. In Japan, there were 41 pertussis deaths when the program was discontinued, and in the Soviet Union, there were 1,700 diphtheria deaths when their program was discontinued. Many argue that the diseases that children are vaccinated against are safer than the vaccine. Here we see a handout to parents from 1963. It primarily indicates keeping your child home and does not alarm parents regarding these common diseases. Those against mandatory vaccination argue we should return to such an approach, and all will be well as it was in 1963. But what you don't see still exists regardless of whether you directly experience its effects or not. Let's look at the stats. From CDC data, in the decade before 1963, when a vaccine became available, nearly all children got measles by the time they were 15 years of age, about 90%. It is estimated that 3 to 4 million people in the United States were infected each year. Also, each year, an estimated 400 to 500 people died. 48,000 people were hospitalized, and 1,000 suffered encephalitis from measles. So let's do some of the math to predict what would have happened had the vaccine not been introduced. In 1963, the population was around 189 million, with 3 to 4 million people affected, which is about 2% of the population. And on average, 400 people died, 48,000 people were hospitalized, and 1,000 developed encephalitis. And the estimates for now, based on the population in 2018 of 327 million, is that about 6.5 million people would be affected if we keep the 2% effect rate, and about 650 would die each year. There would also be about 75,000 hospitalized and about 1,600 with encephalitis. Let's look at the logic from a post regarding the dangers of the vaccine and then use our math. Quote, the Associated Press stated there have been no measles deaths reported in the U.S. since 2003, based on statements made by the director of the CDC's National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Disease. Meanwhile, VAERS, which is the Vaccination Adverse Event Reporting System, captures only a very small percentage of the actual number of injuries and deaths associated with measles vaccines. And they reported 108 deaths associated with measles vaccines since 2003. However, the vaccine is apparently a victim of its own success. Because the vaccine was effective over 15 years, there were only about 1,500 cases. The death rate would then be expected to be, at worst, 1 to 2. So even if the data is correct, 108 deaths since 2003, the comparison to measles is apples and oranges because the disease literally didn't exist due to the effectiveness of the vaccine. Deaths related to the vaccine would then be the only measles-related deaths possible. Without the vaccine, the rate would be projected to be minimally 650 per year, as our past calculations demonstrated, for a total of 9,750 deaths, not counting hospitalizations and cases of encephalitis. So that's our local world, the U.S., but from a global perspective, it's been estimated that from 2000 to 2016, there was an 84% decrease in measles, and that approximately 20.4 million deaths were prevented by vaccination. In part 2 of this presentation, we will look at commonly held beliefs about vaccines that are from an evidence-based perspective, not true, where the information is coming from, and how this influences what we say and do as chiropractors.